The day started like so many others, too silent for someone who has already gotten used to talking to herself. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the coffee cooling slowly, watching the dim light pass through the old curtain. Since I became a widow, the days seemed to repeat themselves without resistance. Nothing changed, and maybe that's why I believed that nothing else could go wrong. I was wrong, very wrong. That would be the last day I would wake up feeling safe inside my own home. The noise of mail falling through the crack in the door broke the silence like a dry crack. I got up with some difficulty, mentally complaining about my knees, and picked up the envelopes from the floor. Bills, propaganda, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw the official letterhead. My full name, Margaret Lewis, printed with a formality that has always caused me discomfort. I felt a tightness in my chest before I even opened it. Something inside me already knew that that letter did not bring good news. I read the first line twice, then a third, trying to understand if my eyes were deceiving me. The letter said that I had 30 days to vacate the property. 30 days. The house where I raised my children, where I buried my husband in memories, where every wall knew my story. The reason was a contract signed years earlier, authorizing a financial operation that now justified the seizure of the property. My hands began to tremble, and I had to sit down again to keep from falling. I continued reading, even with blurry vision. The text was cold, technical, impersonal. There was no room for explanations or appeals, just facts, dates, numbers. And then, at the bottom of the page, I saw the copy of the attached document. My heart almost stopped. There was my signature, Clara, readable, unmistakable. My name spelled exactly as I always wrote, but I had never signed that. Never. The certainty was as strong as the fear that began to overwhelm me. The first reaction was to think that I was forgetting things. This idea hit me violently, because that was exactly what my son always hinted at. "You've been confused, Mom. Maybe you don't remember because it's been a while." But no, I knew. I remembered every important contract I had ever signed in my life. I remembered it because I was always afraid of making mistakes. I have always read everything carefully. That signature did not represent my decision. It represented something made by me, without me. I got up and started walking around the house as if the walls could explain to me what was happening. Each step increased the feeling that the ground was no longer firm. I looked at the old photos, the worn furniture, the clock stopped in the living room. All that was now threatened by a piece of paper. A paper that said I agreed to lose everything. The injustice was so great that I lacked air. It was as if my own identity had been stolen. I sat on the couch and reread the letter one more time, looking for some mistake, some detail that would cancel it all out. But the more I read, the more real it became. The deadline was true. The threat was concrete. And the signature? The signature was considered valid. I felt ashamed for not fully understanding those terms, for always having trusted that someone would take care of these things for me. Maybe I had been naive. Maybe that's exactly what they expected of me. I picked up the phone to call my son, but stopped before dialing. A part of me was afraid of the answer, afraid of hearing once again that I was exaggerating, that I must be confusing things. Another part, smaller but more lucid, began to suspect that this situation was not an accident, that someone had made decisions in my place, that someone used my name as if it were a tool. I placed the letter on the table and ran my finger over the signature. My name, my handwriting, my falsified consent. It was at that moment that something changed inside me. The fear was still there, heavy and suffocating, but something else began to emerge. A silent indignation, a bitter sense of betrayal. I didn't know yet who had done it or how, but I knew one thing. That signature was the beginning of something much bigger. At that moment, sitting alone in my living room, I realized that my life, as I knew it, had just been torn apart along with that letter. I could lose my home, my security, my dignity. But what hurt me the most was realizing that someone, at some point, decided that I didn't need to be consulted about my own destiny. And for the first time in many years, I felt like I couldn't be silent anymore. The fact that you have chosen to listen to this story so far is no accident. It says a lot about your sensitivity and attention to what really matters. What follows is not just a personal account. It is a truth that can happen to any of us, in silence. If you believe stories like this need to keep being told, subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps these voices alive. I spent the night with virtually no sleep, the letter on the kitchen table as a cruel reminder that my life was about to change. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name on that signature. In the morning, with my hands still shaking, I decided to call Daniel. My eldest son was always the responsible one, which solved the practical things. Part of me still believed that he would have a simple explanation, something that would dispel that nightmare. I needed to believe in this so I wouldn't fall apart. When he answered, his voice sounded rushed, almost annoyed that I was calling so early. I explained carefully that I had received a strange letter, which spoke of losing the house. On the other end of the line, there was a brief, heavy silence. When I mentioned the contract and the signature, I felt something change in his tone. It was no surprise. It was impatience. Daniel sighed and said that I must be confusing things, that these issues were too complex for me to understand on my own. I tried to explain that I would never sign something like that I would never put the house at risk. He laughed lightly, a short laugh that hurt more than a scream. He said that I was exaggerating, that I might not remember because it had been many years. That sentence fell like a direct blow. It wasn't the first time he'd insinuated that my memory was failing, but he'd never been so explicit. For the first time, I felt ashamed of myself for having to defend myself. I insisted that I was absolutely sure, that I remembered everything. He replied that he would stop by later, accompanied by his wife, to take a look at the papers. The way he said that bothered me deeply. It didn't seem to help. It felt like supervision. I hung up the phone feeling like I'd done something wrong just for the sake of questioning. I spent a few minutes staring at the wall, trying to organize my thoughts, feeling my heart beating too fast for someone to sit. Daniel and my daughter-in-law arrived in the early afternoon. She entered looking around as if she were evaluating the house with different eyes. I offered coffee, but they refused. I placed the documents on the table, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained everything again. My son took the papers, read them quickly, and said that it seemed normal. Normal. That word echoed in my head like a mockery. How could something like this be normal? My daughter-in-law then said in a very sweet tone that maybe I had agreed to it for the sake of the family, and then forgotten. He said that it was common at my age to sign things without remembering properly. I felt my face burn. It wasn't just discredit, it was humiliation. They talked about me as if I wasn't there, as if I were a confused child. Every sentence of theirs seemed to push the blame onto me. I tried to impose myself. I said I wanted to look for a lawyer. Daniel immediately reacted, saying that he didn't need it, that it would only create confusion. He said that lawyers were expensive, that I didn't have the head for this kind of stress. The word incapable was not spoken, but it was implicit in every argument. I realized, with a knot in my stomach, that they didn't want me to investigate anything. When they left, the house became even quieter than usual. I sat back on the couch, feeling a deep tiredness, as if I had aged 10 years in a few hours. The pain came not only from the risk of losing the house, but from something much more cruel, the feeling of being alone against everyone. The people I trusted the most didn't believe me. Or worse, they didn't want to believe it. I spent the rest of the afternoon reliving every word of the conversation, every look, every impatient sigh. Everything began to take on a new meaning. It wasn't just disinterest. There was something defensive about their behavior, something that made me feel, for the first time, that maybe that signature wasn't just a system error. Maybe it was closer to home than I'd like to admit. When night fell, I went to bed with my chest tight and my mind alert. I still had no proof of anything, but a certainty began to slowly form inside me. If I accepted that explanation, I would lose more than the house. I would lose my voice, my autonomy, who I was. And even though I was afraid, I began to understand that no one would fight for me if I didn't start fighting alone. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. The silence of the house seemed heavier, almost hostile. I walked to the kitchen and found the letter exactly where I had left it, as if it were waiting for me. I prepared coffee on automatic, but I didn't smell it. I didn't taste it. My mind was stuck on that signature, the curve of the M, the final stroke of the S. It was mine, but it wasn't. I sat down at the table and began to look at the document more closely than the day before. I grabbed my glasses, brought the paper closer to my face, as if proximity could reveal a hidden truth. I compared the signature with others I found on old papers, kept in a drawer, bills, contracts, cards. There were slight differences, almost imperceptible details, but enough to give me goosebumps. Whoever had signed it knew exactly how I wrote my name. The cruelest doubt began to set in. What if I had actually signed and forgotten? This question hurt me deeply because it touched something very intimate, my confidence in myself. I sat quietly, trying to mentally reconstruct the past years, remembering every important decision. I remembered pains, dates, faces. It didn't make sense to forget something that would put my home at risk. I got up and went to the bedroom, where I kept boxes with old documents. I opened them one by one, sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers that told my story. Each leaf seemed a proof that I had always been careful. I always read before signing. I always asked. I was always afraid of making mistakes. That signature clashed with the woman I had always been. This realization brought a mixture of relief and terror. As I fiddled with the papers, I remembered how many times Daniel offered to sort it all out for me. He said that I didn't have to worry, that I had been through this before. I accepted, tired, thinking I was careful. Now, each of these memories seemed tarnished. I started to feel a pain in my chest that was not physical. It was the pain of realizing that my trust may have been used against me. I swiped my finger again over the signature printed on the document. The paint seemed to mock me. I thought about how many decisions were made in that role without me knowing. I thought about how a simple pen can change an entire life. It was scary to realize that my name, something that has always represented who I am, could be used as a weapon. The fear of going crazy still haunted my thoughts, fueled by the words of my son and daughter-in-law. But for the first time, I began to feel something different, a discreet, almost timid firmness. I might not understand laws, but I understood myself, and inside me, the certainty grew. I hadn't signed that. I looked around the house, as if looking for unseen witnesses. The walls, the furniture, everything seemed to hold secrets. That house knew my routines, my habits, my quirks. She knew I wouldn't make a decision like that without remembering. It was strange to seek validation in things, but at that moment, any support was needed. In the late afternoon, I sat down again at the table and arranged the documents in order. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt like I was doing something for myself. Small, almost insignificant, but it was a start. The signature still haunted me, but now it wasn't just a symbol of fear. It became a clue, a proof that something very wrong had happened. When night fell, I was no longer the same woman as the day before. Absolute panic had given way to a determined restlessness. I was still afraid, yes, but I was also alert. Someone had messed with my life without my permission, and I was beginning to understand that that signature would not leave my head, because it was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. I spent almost the entire night awake, reliving old scenes as if they were badly edited films. Situations that once seemed normal now appeared distorted, loaded with a new and disturbing meaning. I remembered the times when Daniel would sit at my desk with a stack of papers, saying that it was a simple thing, that I didn't have to worry. I trusted it. I have always trusted. It was my son. I never imagined that those memories could hide something so dark. At dawn, I walked around the house slowly, touching the furniture as if looking for balance. Each corner brought a memory, but now they were accompanied by uncomfortable questions. When did I start delegating everything? When did I stop asking? Maybe it was after my husband's death, when emotional fatigue left me vulnerable. I just wanted peace. I never thought that this need could be exploited. I sat in the armchair in the living room and closed my eyes, trying to remember a specific moment when I had signed something important without reading it. Nothing came. Only the memory of Daniel's voice, firm, sure, saying that everything was under control. This phrase now echoed like a well-set trap. Control for whom? For me, certainly not. The feeling of having been led, gently pushed out of the decisions of my own life, began to revolt me. I recalled one episode in particular years ago when he insisted that I sign some papers quickly because the bank was pressuring. I hesitated, asked to read it calmly, but he was impatient. He said that I was suspicious for no reason, that I was getting paranoid. I ended up giving in. I didn't remember the content, but I remembered the discomfort. Now, this discomfort made perfect sense. I got up and went to the bedroom, where I found an old folder with my notes. Little handwritten reminders, lists of accounts, double-checked values. That was proof that I had always been careful. I was always afraid of depending on others. Realizing that, even so, someone managed to run over me was painful. Not because I was weak, but because I trusted too much in those who I shouldn't. The memories began to line up like pieces of a cruel puzzle. Hasty decisions. The conversations cut off. The papers pulled out of front of me before I could understand. Nothing had been explicit. Everything was done calmly, patiently, and with a smile on his face. That was what made the betrayal even harder to swallow. There was no confrontation, only silent manipulation. I felt a mixture of anger and shame. Anger for realizing how much I was deceived. Shame for having allowed this to happen. But little by little, I began to understand that it was not my fault. I trusted because to love is also to trust. The mistake was not believing. It was someone having used this love as a tool. This conclusion brought tears to my eyes, but also a strange sense of clarity. I spent the afternoon writing down everything I remembered, every strange situation, every conversation that now made sense. It was as if I was reclaiming parts of myself that had been erased. The more I wrote, the firmer I felt. Memories ceased to be traps and became evidence. It wasn't legal evidence yet, but it was evidence for myself. As the sun began to set, I realized that something had changed. I was still scared, but I was no longer paralyzed. The memories, once confusing, now gave me direction. If someone had planned that for years, I could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. The woman he trusted blindly began to disappear. In her place, someone was willing to understand, question, and react. That night, before going to sleep, I silently repeated a phrase I never thought I would need to say. I'm not crazy. Someone messed with my life without my consent. The memories, finally, were on my side. And for the first time since it all began, I felt like I was one step closer to the truth. The next day, I decided that I needed answers outside of my family. The silence of that house no longer protected me. It only amplified my fears. I took the documents, organized everything in a folder, and left for the bank where I had kept my account for decades. Every step up to the car felt heavier than usual, as if I was going to confirm a sentence. On the way, I tried to convince myself that there could still be a simple mistake, something easy to solve. When I arrived at the bank, I was attended by an employee too young to understand the weight I was carrying on my chest. I calmly explained the situation, handed over the papers, and asked him to check the contract. As he typed on the computer, I watched the movement around, people coming in and out, lives going on normally. It gave me a strange feeling of isolation, as if only mine was about to fall apart. He came back with a neutral, overly professional expression. He said that the contract was valid, correctly registered, and that there was no ongoing dispute. He spoke of deadlines, interest, procedures. Every word sounded distant, almost unreal. When I asked about the possibility of fraud, he replied that, legally, the signature confirmed my consent. That hit me like a punch. My body reacted before my mind, and I felt my hands get cold. I asked, almost in a whisper, what would happen if I couldn't resolve the situation? He replied without emotion, the property would be taken, and I would have to leave. Simple as that. The house where I lived most of my life reduced to a line in a system. I wanted to cry right there, but I held back. I didn't want to look weak. I already felt too invisible. I left the bench with the certainty that this was not just a distant threat. It was real, concrete. It was no longer an abstract fear, but an ongoing process that moved forward without caring about me. I sat in the car for a few minutes before I was able to start the engine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart, but the sense of urgency only increased. On the way back, I thought of Daniel. I thought about how he would react if he knew I had gone to the bank alone. I'd probably say I was getting in where I shouldn't be. This realization brought me a painful clarity. Someone did not want me to have this information. Someone benefited from my silence and my obedience. And this person was much closer than I would have liked. When I got home, I found a message on the phone. It was my son's. He asked if I had done something stupid going to the bank. The tone was not one of concern, but of control. My stomach turned. He knew. Somehow, he always seemed to know before I did. That lit a definitive alert inside my head. I sat at the table and reread the message several times. For the first time, I felt afraid of him. Not a physical fear, but a deep fear of realizing that my vulnerability was being used against me. The threat now was not just to lose the house. It was losing my autonomy, my voice, my ability to decide. I was being pushed, slowly, out of life itself. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the house, observing every detail with different eyes. The marks on the wall, the garden I took care of for years, the room where I slept next to my husband, all of that was now at real risk. The injustice was so great that it made me nauseous. It wasn't just a contract. It was an erasure. That night, I sat alone in the dark room and understood something fundamental. If I didn't act, no one would act for me. The threat had ceased to be invisible. She was there, knocking on the door, counting the days. And even scared, I realized that I could no longer retreat. Something in me was beginning to harden. I didn't know how to fight yet, but I knew I needed to start. I was in the backyard trying to pretend normality, watering plants that no longer seemed to recognize me, when I heard Mrs. Helen's voice on the other side of the fence. She was always too observant for my taste, the kind who notices when something is out of place. That day, it was no different. He asked if I was okay, saying that he had seen me leave too early the day before. I tried to smile, but I failed. Something in me was tired of pretending. Helen approached carefully, as if she didn't want to scare an injured animal. He said I looked haggard, paler than usual. Without knowing exactly why, I started talking. I didn't tell everything at once, but I mentioned the letter, the risk of losing the house, the signature that wasn't mine. I expected a look of pity or disbelief. Instead, I saw concentration, true attention. That took me apart. She asked to see the documents. I hesitated for a second, still stuck in the habit of not exposing my problems, but I ended up bringing the briefcase. Helen put on her glasses, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to analyze everything with an almost surgical calm. He pointed out dates, values, inconsistencies. She said she worked for years as an accountant before retiring. My heart started beating faster. For the first time, someone wasn't treating me as confused. Helen frowned at the sight of the signature. She said it was very well done, but that there was something strange about the pressure of the stroke. He talked about patterns, about how a person's hand changes over time. That was too technical for me, but enough to rekindle my hope. She confidently stated that it deserved a serious investigation. It wasn't just a lapse of memory, as my son insisted. She also noticed something I hadn't noticed: an attached power of attorney, signed around the same time. He asked if I remembered having granted broad powers to anyone. My stomach sank. That word echoed like a sentence. Broad powers. I didn't remember any of that. Helen looked me in the eye and said something I'll never forget. "Margaret, someone had been preparing for a long time." I felt my legs weaken and I had to sit down. It was terrifying to hear it out loud, but also liberating. It wasn't paranoia. It was not weakness. It was method. Helen continued talking, explaining that cases like this were more common than I imagined, especially with older people. He said that the manipulation almost always came from within the family. That sentence hurt, but it made sense. She then mentioned a lawyer she knew who specializes in financial abuse against the elderly. He said that he took these cases seriously, that he did not underestimate anyone. My first impulse was to retreat. Lawyers meant confrontation, exposure, definitive rupture. But Helen held my hand firmly and said I needed to protect myself, that no one would do it for me if I didn't take the first step. I spent that afternoon talking to her, absorbing information, asking questions I never thought I would ask. For the first time since it all began, I felt that I was not alone. Helen had no personal interest, no complicated emotional bond. She only saw what was in front of her, and what she saw was injustice. When she left, the house looked different. Still threatened, still fragile, but less silent. There was now a possibility, a path. It was not a guarantee of victory, but it was something concrete. I looked again at the document folder, and for the first time, I didn't just feel afraid. I felt determination. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how a simple conversation had changed everything. A neighbor, someone who had always been there, was the one who saw what my own family refused to see. I realized that help doesn't always come from where we expect it. And at that moment, I knew that accepting this help did not make me weak. I became prepared. I entered the lawyer's office with my heart racing, holding my briefcase as if it were a shield. The place was simple, without ostentation, different from what I imagined when I thought of lawyers. The walls had old diplomas and black and white photos of people smiling, as if to convey confidence. Even so, I felt small, out of place, with the feeling of being about to be judged before I even spoke. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a watchful eye. There was no hurry in his gestures, nor that impatient air that I had seen so many times in Daniel. We sat down, and he asked me to start from the beginning, at my pace. That simple sentence almost made me cry. For the first time, someone gave me time. I opened the folder slowly and started telling everything, from the letter to the conversations with my son. While I spoke, he did not interrupt me. He took notes, nodded, sometimes asked for an extra detail. There was no doubt in his gaze, no suspicion. When I mentioned the signature, he asked to see the document immediately. He watched silently for long seconds, and then asked for other examples of my signature. That close attention made me feel respected, as if my story really mattered. I explained how much they had insinuated that I was confused, that I might not remember things. Hearing this, he frowned and took a deep breath. He said that this type of narrative was common in cases of financial abuse against the elderly. The word abuse echoed strongly within me. I had never thought of my situation in this way, but as I listened to her, everything seemed to fall into place painfully and clearly. He talked about patterns, about how manipulation usually starts in a subtle, almost invisible way. He said that the goal is always the same: to take away autonomy without the victim noticing. As he spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief to finally be understood. Revolt for realizing that all that could have been planned coldly, without any love involved. When I asked if there was anything I could still do, he looked at me seriously and said yes. He explained that it would be difficult, that it would involve confrontation and exposure, but that it was not impossible. He spoke about graphotechnical expertise, about contract review, about legal challenge. Each term felt heavy, but at the same time, it was as if I was being introduced to weapons I never knew I could use. He was also honest in saying that the process would affect my family. He asked if I was prepared for this. I was silent for a few seconds. I thought about my son, my grandchildren, family meals that might never happen again. The pain of this possibility almost made me retreat. But then I thought about the house, my dignity, my freedom, and I replied that I didn't want to live in fear anymore. The lawyer nodded as if he was already expecting that answer. He said that, from that moment on, everything needed to be done carefully and strategically. He asked me not to confront anyone alone, to keep all the messages, to write down every detail. He spoke to me as someone capable, conscious, responsible. That gave me back something I didn't even realize I had lost: the feeling of being the owner of my decisions. When I left the office, the world looked the same, but I wasn't. I was still threatened. There was still a long way to go. But now I had an ally. Someone who didn't see me as fragile, nor as a problem to be solved quickly. Someone who saw me as a wronged woman, with the right to fight. In the car, before starting the engine, I took a deep breath and felt my hands steady on the steering wheel. For the first time since that letter arrived, I didn't cry. The fear was still there, silent, but now he shared space with something new, a timid confidence. Still information, but real. I was no longer alone, and that changed everything. I left the lawyer's office with the strange feeling that I was entering a war without being sure who exactly the enemy was. In the following days, I began to live in a state of alert. Every call, every message, every silence seemed charged with intent. The lawyer asked me to gather everything I could: old contracts, statements, notes, any paper that had passed through my hands in recent years. That's how I began to realize the real size of what was hidden. I spread the documents on the living room table, covering almost the entire surface. Roles that once meant little now gained enormous weight. Repeated dates, values I didn't remember authorizing, decisions made at times when I could barely deal with grief. The pattern began to form before my eyes, slow and cruel. It was not an isolated mistake. It was a sequence, a plan. I found contracts signed at delicate periods in my life, shortly after my husband's death, when I was emotionally vulnerable. I remembered how Daniel appeared with ready-made solutions, saying that I didn't have to worry. "Leave it to me, Mom." At the time, those words sounded like relief. Now they seemed like a warning that I ignored. Each document was a confirmation that someone had been deciding for me for a long time. The lawyer confirmed my suspicions in a short, direct call. He said that he had identified strange financial transactions and that the power of attorney gave too broad powers. That explained how such big decisions could be made without me noticing. When I hung up, I felt an emptiness in my stomach. It was no longer just fear. It was pain. A deep pain for understanding that the betrayal was not punctual, but built with patience. I spent hours sitting, staring at those sheets, trying to accept reality. It was not easy to admit that my own son could have done that to me. Motherhood always blinds us in some way. We want to believe that love protects, that blood ties are unbreakable. Discovering that these same ties can be used as chains was devastating. I cried alone, in silence, so as not to admit out loud what was already impossible to deny. Daniel's messages began to arrive more frequently. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help, if I had spoken to anyone. The tone seemed gentle, but now I could see something behind it. Control, fear of losing control. I didn't respond immediately. For the first time, I didn't feel obliged to explain anything. That small attitude gave me an unexpected sense of power. In the evening, I called Helen and told her what I had discovered. She listened to it all in silence, and then said something simple but firm: "Now you know. And knowing hurts, but it liberates." That phrase kept echoing in my head. It did, yes. It hurt to realize that my life had been run like a business, but it also freed me from doubt, guilt, the feeling of going crazy. I began to understand that the truth doesn't always come as an immediate relief. Sometimes it arrives as an open wound, which burns before it heals. I was in the middle of this process, bleeding inside, but conscious. Each discovery took away some of the naivety that was still left in me, and along with it came a cold, almost strategic clarity. That night, I walked around the house with a different eye. It was no longer just the place I could miss. It was the symbol of everything they tried to take from me without me noticing. My story, my choices, my voice. The truth was starting to hurt, but it was also starting to strengthen me. I was still injured, but I was no longer blind. Before going to sleep, I wrote in a notebook something I never thought I would need to write. It was not an oversight. It was manipulation. When I put this on paper, I felt a weight leave my chest. The pain was still there, but now it had a name, and when something has a name, it can be faced. From that day on, I started to live with a question hammering in my head. How far was I willing to go to protect myself? It was not a simple decision. Every step I took toward the truth took me away from the idea of family that I had carried all my life. I felt torn between two pains: That of facing my own child, or that of letting myself be quietly erased? None of the options seemed fair, but only one would allow me to continue existing. Daniel started to appear more often, always without warning. He knocked on the door with that rehearsed smile, asking if I was eating right, if I was resting. I answered little, observing every gesture, every word. Everything sounded different now. The care felt like vigilance. The concern seemed to be a charge. It was frightening to realize how the same attitude can change meaning when the truth begins to emerge. On one of these visits, he casually remarked that perhaps I had better think about simplifying life. I said that the house was too big for me, that keeping it all alone was heavy. He talked about the possibility of me living closer to them, maybe in a smaller place. I listened in silence with my heart racing. Each sentence seemed carefully calculated to make me accept the loss as something natural, almost a favor. When I mentioned that I was talking to a lawyer, his face changed for a second. It was quick, but I saw it. The mask of tranquility slipped, giving way to something harder. He asked who had put this idea in my head, insinuating that someone was influencing me. For the first time, I answered firmly that this decision was mine. The silence that followed was heavy, almost threatening. After he left, I sat alone in the living room and cried. It wasn't just sadness, it was mourning. I mourn for the son I thought I knew, for the relationship that might never be the same. I thought about my grandchildren, birthdays, Christmases. Everything seemed about to fragment. The idea of being seen as the ungrateful, problematic mother terrified me, but the alternative was even worse, to be slowly erased. I talked at length with the lawyer that same day. He was clear that the process would expose things that might never be unsaid. He asked if I was prepared to face accusations, emotional manipulations, attempts to discredit me. Hearing that scared me, but it also made me realize that I was already being attacked, just in silence. Helen also played an important role at that time. It reminded me of something simple but powerful. Survival is not selfishness. He said that I had spent my life taking care of others, and that now I needed to take care of myself. That phrase accompanied me for the rest of the day. I always put my family above all else, but no one seemed willing to do the same for me. I spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing pros and cons that shouldn't exist. Love should not require self-annihilation. Family should not mean submission. Gradually, I understood that I was not the one who was destroying anything. The cracks already existed. I just refused to pretend I couldn't see anymore. The next morning, I made a quiet decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront anyone. I just committed to myself. I would go all the way, no matter what it takes. Not for revenge, but for survival, for dignity. I needed to prove, first of all to myself, that I still had the right to choose. As I made coffee, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. The guilt was still there, but it no longer commanded my actions. I knew that the path would be painful, lonely at many times, but I also knew that to retreat would mean to disappear. Between family and survival, I finally understood that I needed to choose myself. What comes now is the hardest part to tell, because this is where I lost more than documents. I lost the idea of who I thought I could trust. Bringing this to light means reliving an emotional cost that I carried alone for too long. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that certain truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to preserve stories that can no longer be silenced. Daniel's silence after our last conversation was not a relief, it was a warning. I felt it in the air, in the way the phone remained too quiet. People who lose control rarely accept this in peace. I spent the next few days trying to keep up with the routine, but everything in me was on alert. Every car that slowed down in front of my house made me look out the window. I was being watched, even if from afar. The first movement came disguised as concern. I got a call from a doctor I had never met, saying that my son had commented that I was confused and that it might be good to assess my condition. The word condition pierced me like a blade. It wasn't help. It was an attempt to create a record, a narrative. I hung up with sweaty hands, feeling for the first time a more concrete fear than losing the house. On the same day, a social worker showed up unannounced. Polite, smiling, asking too many questions. I wanted to know if I ate well, if I remembered my medications, if I knew what day it was. I answered everything calmly, but inside I trembled. That was no coincidence. It was strategy. They were trying to build the image of an incapable, vulnerable woman, someone who needed to be taken care of. When I told the lawyer, he didn't seem surprised. He said that this was a common movement when those who manipulate feel that they are losing ground. Questioning the victim's sanity is an effective way to silence them. Hearing this made me nauseous. My own son was willing to turn me into a clinical case to keep tabs on my life. The betrayal took on even more cruel contours. Daniel appeared at home again days later, this time with a different tone, less authoritarian, sweeter. He said that he only wanted my good, that I was wearing myself out too much, that this process could kill me. He spoke as if I was too fragile to deal with the truth. I listened to him in silence, watching as each word was carefully chosen to scare me and make me give up. When he suggested almost casually that perhaps it was better for me to consider a temporary hospitalization to rest my head, something broke for good inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said, with a firmness that I was unaware of, that any decision about my health would be made by me and my doctors. I saw the shock on his face. For the first time, he realized that I was no longer under control. After he left, my legs failed and I had to sit down. Courage takes its toll. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely lucid. Now it was not just about goods or documents. It was about my freedom. They were trying to silence me, invalidate me, erase me in a definitive way, and I couldn't allow that. I spent that night reviewing old messages, writing down dates, recording every attempt at intimidation. The lawyer had instructed me to document everything, and I followed this to the letter. Every detail could be a weapon. I realized that, without realizing it, I was learning to defend myself, not with brute force, but with attention, patience, and strategy. Helen also became more present, almost like a silent sentry. She told me not to answer anyone without warning, to keep doors locked, not to let myself be isolated. Her support was discreet, but fundamental. In the midst of so many attempts to paint me as weak, that friendship was an anchor, someone who saw my strength when I doubted her. Their silent counterattack just showed me how much I was on the right track. No one tries to silence those who do not represent a threat. This realization, although frightening, also strengthened me. If they were going so far, it was because they had something serious to lose, and that meant the truth was closer than ever. That morning, sitting alone in the living room, I understood something essential. I was no longer reacting. I was resisting. Each attempt to diminish me now found an attentive, conscious, and prepared woman. They didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. And this time, I wouldn't be pushed off the board. Gradually, I began to realize that something in me had changed definitively. I no longer woke up with that feeling of confusion and fear that accompanied me in the first weeks. The fear still existed, yes, but now it was accompanied by attention and preparation. I observed. I took notes. I thought before reacting. The woman who trembled before an official envelope was giving way to someone firmer, more aware of her own worth. I started to study my own documents like I had never done before. He sat at the table calmly, pen in hand, underlining clauses, writing down doubts, setting dates. At first, everything seemed like a strange language, but gradually I began to recognize patterns, repetitions, traps. It was exhausting, sometimes humiliating to admit how much I didn't know, but each new understanding strengthened me. Knowledge has become a silent form of resistance. The lawyer noticed this change in the first following conversations. He said that I was more objective, more secure when asking questions. That surprised me. I never saw myself as strategic, but I realized that life had pushed me into this role. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. When everything is at stake, clarity is no longer optional. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed disconcerted. His messages became shorter, less frequent. When he appeared, he no longer spoke to me as before. There was caution in his tone, as if he was dealing with someone unpredictable. That saddened me, but it also showed me that something had changed in the dynamic between us. I was no longer the submissive mother, ready to agree in the name of peace. On a particular afternoon, he tried again to take control of the conversation, explaining what would be best for me. I waited for him to finish and, in a firm voice, said that any decision would go through my lawyer. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Never in our entire relationship had I imposed such a clear limit. I felt my heart race, but I didn't back down. After he left, I sat for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. I didn't feel immediate guilt. I felt something new, respect for myself. I realized that the fragility that was always attributed to me was not weakness. It was the accumulated fatigue of a lifetime of giving in. Now I was choosing not to give in, and that required courage every day. Helen once commented that I walked differently, more upright, more present. I laughed at the remark, but I knew she was right. My posture had changed, not only physically, but emotionally. I spoke less, observed more. He didn't explain it to me all the time. He did not ask permission to exist. It was a quiet but powerful change. I started to organize my routine with more intention. Defined times, appointments noted, everything recorded. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Every attitude of mine now had a purpose. I was building a defense that was not only legal, but personal. The feeling of being prepared lessened the fear of being taken by surprise again. There were nights when I cried alone, missing the past that would not return. The transformation takes its toll. Losing the illusion of a perfect family hurts deeply. But even in those moments, I didn't want to go back. The woman I was becoming was perhaps more lonely, but she was true, and that had immense value. I began to understand that strength is not always noise or direct confrontation. Sometimes strength is sitting at the table, reading every line, asking the right question, saying no when you've always said yes. I was learning this in practice day after day, and even without fully realizing it, I was preparing myself for the most difficult moment of all. When I looked in the mirror that night, I saw wrinkles, tiredness, marks of time, but I also saw something I hadn't seen in years: firmness. It was not arrogance, nor coldness. It was consciousness. I was no longer the fragile woman they tried to paint. I was someone who had been hurt, yes, but who had learned to stand up. And this woman was ready for the coming confrontation. I entered the forum that morning with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The building was cold, impersonal, and every footstep echoed too loudly in the long hallway. People hurried by, carrying folders, talking about subjects that had nothing to do with my life, which at that moment seemed suspended in the air. I took several deep breaths before entering the courtroom, trying to keep my hands steady. Daniel was already there when I arrived. I avoided looking directly at him, but felt his presence as a heavy shadow. He talked quietly with his lawyer, serious, restrained. That image caused me deep pain, because I never imagined that I would see my own son on the other side of a courtroom. At the same time, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. I wasn't there for revenge. It was there to exist. I sat next to my lawyer, who spoke to me in a low voice, explaining how it would all happen. His calmness helped me not to fall apart. He said that I just needed to answer with the truth, in my own way, in my time. That gave me strength. I didn't need to stage anything. My story was hard enough. When the referee entered, the atmosphere changed. The murmurs ceased, and everything became more serious, more real. My name was called, and I felt a chill go up my spine. Hearing Margaret Lewis in that context made me think of how many times my name had been used without me. Now he was there, connected to my voice, to my presence. That mattered more than any document. The papers began to be presented. Contracts, dates, signatures enlarged on screens. I saw my signature designed for everyone, analyzed as evidence. The grapho-technical expertise pointed out inconsistencies, subtle differences that confirmed what I had always known. Hearing an expert say, in technical language, that signature was probably not mine made me hold back tears. Not of sadness, but of relief. Daniel was called to speak. I heard cold explanations, carefully assembled justifications. He said that everything was done to protect me, that I was fragile at the time, that he only tried to help. Every word sounded rehearsed. For the first time, I saw clearly the distance between speech and reality. That was not taken care of. It was control. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly. I felt my legs trembling, but the voice came out firm. I told my story without exaggeration, without unnecessary accusations. I spoke of trust, of delegation, of the moment when I realized that decisions had been made without me. I looked at the judge, not my son. I needed to be heard there, not to convince those who had already betrayed me. As I spoke, I noticed the attentive silence in the room. There was no longer that feeling of being seen as confused. I was a woman reporting facts, with coherence, with pain, but with lucidity. That was liberating. For the first time in a long time, no one interrupted, no one doubted, no one diminished me. The lawyer presented messages, records, attempts to discredit me. Each piece of evidence added weight to the narrative I had been trying to explain for months. I felt the impact of that in the air. The truth didn't need to scream. She simply supported herself. When the hearing was closed, I was exhausted but whole. There was still no final decision, but something fundamental had already happened. My version had been recorded, recognized, considered. As I left the room, I avoided looking at Daniel again. Not because of weakness, but because I didn't need it anymore. That step wasn't about him. It was about me. Outside, the sun seemed stronger, almost offensive after so much time indoors. I took a deep breath, feeling the air enter my lungs more easily. The confrontation had taken place. Public. Irreversible. I didn't know exactly how it would all end, but I knew that something essential had changed inside. I had spoken, and the world finally had listened. The days following the hearing were eerily quiet. No call from Daniel, no message crossed, no veiled warning. It was as if, suddenly, everyone was waiting. I was too. waiting for the weight of the consequences to fall for good. Even so, something inside me was different. The anxiety still existed, but it no longer dominated me. I had done my part. The truth now walked on its own. When I received the court's notice calling for the continuation of the proceedings, I felt a brief tightness in my chest, but nothing compared to the panic of before. I entered that building again with firmer steps. The people were the same, the runners too, but I wasn't. I carried with me the experience of having been heard. That changes everything. Even if the world doesn't change immediately, we do. This time, the room was fuller. There were other lawyers, an additional expert, and even a representative of the bank. The atmosphere was denser, as if everyone knew that something definitive was about to be said. When my name was mentioned again, I felt proud. Proud of not having backed down, of not having accepted the role of a confused woman that they tried to impose on me. The new forensics was presented with technical details that I didn't fully understand, but I understood enough. The signatures compared, the patterns analyzed, the conclusions clear. Fraud was not only possible, it was likely. Hearing this out loud in front of so many people was like watching the public dismantling of a lie built for years. I felt a mixture of relief and deep sadness. Daniel tried to defend himself again, but something had changed in the general tone. The questions were more direct, less tolerant. His explanations sounded fragile in the face of the evidence. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I didn't quite recognize. It wasn't anger, it was fear. That realization hurt me more than any accusation. Seeing my own son cornered by the truth was a silent coup. The judge spoke firmly at the end of the session. I said that there were clear indications of manipulation and abuse of trust, and that measures would be taken to protect my autonomy while the process progressed. That phrase echoed in me as a belated but necessary confirmation. My autonomy. Something so basic, so mine, had to be defended in public to be respected. As I left the room, I noticed different looks on me. Not of pity, but of recognition. I was no longer the confused lady. I was the woman who faced her own family to defend her life. It doesn't bring immediate joy, but it does bring dignity. And dignity changes the way we breathe. Outside, journalists were talking about some other case, unrelated to the earthquake that had happened inside me. I smiled slightly, feeling the sun on my face. The truth had echoed, not just in that courtroom, but inside me. I no longer needed to justify myself in silence. Everything was recorded, documented, recognized. That night, I received a short message from Daniel. There was no apology, no attack, just silence translated into a few words. I didn't answer. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because some conversations no longer fit. There are truths that, once said in public, contain certain dialogues forever. Lying in bed, I thought about all that I had lost and all that I was gaining. It wasn't a fair exchange, but it was real. Truth does not return the past, but redefines the future. And I was beginning to understand that, even with scars, I was more whole than I had ever been. The official decision came a few days later, in an envelope that I recognized from afar. My hands no longer trembled as before, but my heart still raced as I tore the paper. The judge recognized the fraud, annulled the disputed documents, and restored my legal autonomy. The house was still mine. Reading those words was like catching her breath after a long time submerged. I had won, but the victory was not accompanied by euphoria. I sat on the couch with the letter on my lap and let the silence envelop me. I didn't cry. Perhaps because I had already cried everything I could throughout that process. Justice had been served on paper, but there were things that no judicial decision could fix. Broken trust is not recomposed with official signatures. The bond between mother and son, once crossed by this type of betrayal, will never be the same again. Daniel didn't come to me after the decision. I didn't look for him either. There was a tacit agreement to distance, as if we both knew that any attempt at conversation would only be more painful. I learned from a third party that he was facing legal and professional consequences. I didn't feel pleasure in it. I didn't feel sorry either. I just accepted. Each one reaps what he builds, even when the harvest comes too late. The hardest thing was dealing with the absence of my grandchildren. They were not to blame for anything, but they ended up caught in the middle of something too big to understand. I thought about them many times, especially at night, wondering if they would ever know the full truth. Maybe so, maybe not. I learned that not all stories need to be told to everyone. Some just continue to exist in silence. Gradually, I began to reorganize my practical life. I updated documents, reviewed accounts, closed doors that should never have been opened. The lawyer helped me structure everything carefully, ensuring that my autonomy was protected from now on. Each signature made consciously was almost a ritual, a reminder that no one else would decide for me. Helen was still present, discreet as ever. We celebrated the decision with a simple coffee in my kitchen. There were no toasts or speeches, just a mutual understanding that this victory had cost them dearly. We talked about common things, as if it were important to remember that life is also made of normality. That helped me not to be stuck only in the trauma. At times, I felt a deep, almost physical sadness. Not for the house, which was saved, but for the family I thought I had. Accepting that certain idealizations die is a kind of silent mourning. I was learning to live with it, without denying the pain, but without allowing it to define me again. I also realized that, despite everything, I didn't want to live hardened. The experience made me more cautious, not bitter. That was important to me. I didn't want the betrayal to be the final chapter of my emotional story. It was part of the path, but it would not be the destination. Over time, I began to feel a different calm. It was not full happiness, but it was stability. I was safe, conscious, in control of my life. The victory did not cure everything, but it gave me back something essential: the possibility of moving forward without constant fear. That night, before going to sleep, I kept the court decision in the same folder where it had all begun. I closed it carefully and put it in the back of the closet. Not as someone who hides, but as someone who closes a cycle. I knew that this story would still accompany me for a long time, but now, she no longer governed me. A few months have passed since everything was officially closed, and the house has returned to a different silence. It was no longer that oppressive silence, full of fear and waiting. It was a firm, almost respectful silence. I kept waking up early, preparing my coffee, sitting at the same table as always. But something essential had changed. I no longer felt small within these walls. The house was not just rightfully mine. She was mine by choice, by struggle, by permanence. I started getting calls from people who heard about my case through the lawyer or the neighborhood. Women for the most part. Some older, others not so much. All with stories too similar to be coincidence. Worried children, helpful nephews, decisions made for their own good. Hearing these voices awakened something in me that I didn't expect. For the first time, I realized that my pain could serve something other than myself. I started to accompany them in meetings, to guide them on the right questions, not to sign anything without understanding, to trust their own memory. I didn't become an expert, nor a heroine. I became a presence. Someone who looks you in the eye and says, "You're not crazy." This, I discovered, has immense power. Each conversation was also a reminder of all that I had learned by force. My relationship with Daniel remained distant. There was no reconciliation, no great final confrontations. Just a silent, definitive withdrawal. Sometimes I think about him, about his grandchildren, about what could have been different. The pain still exists, but it no longer bleeds. I learned that not every story ends with apologies. Some end with limits. And boundaries are also a form of love, for its own sake. Helen continues to be part of my daily life, sitting with me on the porch, commenting on banalities, taking care of the plants. Our friendship deepened without needing great declarations. There are people who come into our lives at critical moments not to be at the center of the story, but to ensure that it continues. She was that to me, a point of support when everything threatened to collapse. I went back to taking care of the house with another look, not out of attachment, but out of autonomy. Every decision, from painting the wall to choosing a repair, became a small exercise in freedom. I signed documents carefully, checked every line, asked questions without shame. The pen, once a symbol of fear, has become a conscious tool. My name now only came out of my hand. Sometimes I find myself reflecting on who I was before all of this. That tired woman, who accepted being put aside to avoid conflicts. I do not despise it. She did what she could with the tools she had, but I know I'm not her anymore. Life went through me in a hard way, and I didn't come out unscathed. I left transformed, more cautious, firmer, more whole. I didn't become suspicious of the world, but I became attentive. I learned that love does not cancel out vigilance, that trust does not require blindness. These lessons didn't come from books. They came from losses. And maybe that's why they are so profound. I carry each one of them with me, not as a weight, but as a structure. Some nights are still difficult. There are memories that come back without asking permission. But now, when that happens, I take a deep breath and remember everything I've been through. From the courtroom, from the firm voice that came out when I least expected it, from the signature projected on a screen that tried to erase me and ended up revealing me. I survived that. That sustains me. Today, when someone looks at me and tries to underestimate me, I no longer explain who I am. I don't raise my voice. I don't argue. I just keep my gaze. There is a calm force in this, a security that does not ask for approval. I am not invincible, nor indestructible. but I am conscious. And consciousness, I learned, is a powerful form of steel. From a paper signed without me, a woman was born who will never again allow herself to be written by others. My story now follows in my hands, with my choices, in my time. It's not perfect. It is not light, but it's mine. And that, for me, is victory enough. If something in this story touched you, share this video thinking about who might be living something similar in silence. What happened here is not an isolated case. It is a pattern that is repeated in many families and contexts. Sharing is an act of solidarity. It can be the push someone needs to recognize, question, and protect themselves. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching? And what about this story stayed with you? Reading these answers really matters to me.